God bless. Welcome to our 12th session. And tonight we're going to cover the subject matter of personal relationships. This is kind of the heart of, in my mind, the heart of the practical aspects of the Sermon on the Mount. And to be able to do what we're going to be looking at in the next couple of sessions here, you would have to be one who is living by the Beatitudes, that the Beatitudes would be your lifestyle. I don't see how people could do this without the Spirit of God and living according to these Beatitudes. So let's turn to Matthew chapter 5, where we'll begin. Matthew chapter 5 and verse 21. You have heard that the ancients were told, you shall not commit murder. And whoever commits murder shall be liable to the court. And that quotation, you shall not commit murder, is from Exodus 20, verse 13, and it's the sixth commandment. It's the sixth commandment of the Ten Commandments. So, and whoever commits murder shall be liable to the court. But I say to you that everyone who is angry with his brother shall be guilty before the court, and whoever says to his brother, you good for nothing, shall be guilty before the Supreme Court. And whoever says, you fool, shall be guilty enough to go into fiery hell. Now this is quite a statement here this Jesus puts forth for us. Again, to not commit adultery, as I said, is the sixth commandment. It's not a prohibition against killing or taking human life. It's a prohibition against murder. And murder is it's an unlawful, premeditated killing of another human being. Some Christians contend that neither war nor capital punishment should be exempt from this prohibition because every human life holds inherent value. In other words, many people think that capital punishment and war, that Christians should not be a part of war and that we should not have capital punishment. But that's really not what this is talking about. This is talking about murder, which is premeditated killing of another, murdering another person. And there's good reason to believe that war and capital punishment are not to be prohibited, especially when you look at verses like Genesis chapter 9, verse 6, whoever sheds man's blood, by man his blood shall be shed. For in the image of God he made man. So the argument for eliminating capital punishment is that every human being is inherently valuable. And what this is saying, because this guy killed someone who was inherently valuable, he should pay the price for it, that there would be a commensurate retribution. And then in Exodus 21:12, it says, he who strikes a man so that he dies shall surely be put to death. And, as you read through the Old Testament, it's very apparent that there was appropriate times for war, and the Old Testament talks about numerous times for the death penalty for a number of injustices. But any of this and all of this is a legal point of view. When it's written in the Old Testament, it's not written to the common person to make these kind of decisions. It's written to the judges. It's a legal matter that should be adjudicated by the people that are responsible for it and not for every person. Jesus deals, however, in this whole subject matter, Jesus is dealing with a much greater issue, that is how to avoid murdering people. That's really the most important part of what he's communicating here. In the Greek, the words that are used for anger, there's two words in particular, or they're the root of all of the words that are translated anger. One of them is orge, it's anger as a state of mind. And the second one is this word thumos, which is used to express an outburst of anger, which attacks others. The word in verse 22 that we were looking at, in verse 22, is the word orge, which means mental anger. So what Jesus is putting here, he's putting the consequences or the judgment for murder to be parallel with the consequences and the judgment for being angry, which is a whole different way of thinking about the subject matter of murder. Let's look at this little bit about anger. If you would turn in your Bibles to Ephesians chapter 4. Ephesians 4. In verse 26. Be angry, and again that's that mental anger, and do not sin. Do not let the sun go down upon your wrath, and do not give the devil an opportunity. So what this is saying is that you can have mental anger without sinning, but you have to deal with it quickly or it can turn into a sinful situation. If you have mental anger, if it isn't resolved, usually gets worse, it grows, and then we move into bitterness and hate, and then an explosion of anger that could cause us to ill affect other people and even murder them. So what Ephesians is saying, be angry. And there's times, like there's a time this is not a command to be angry. It's a command to stop being angry, not to be angry. Be angry and sin not. Do not let the sun go down upon your wrath or your anger, and do not give the devil opportunity. If we don't deal with the anger that we have, we're going to give the devil opportunity to take us down a road that's not very healthy. But there are times in the scripture where there's one record where Jesus is in a situation, there's a man with a withered hand, and the Pharisees that were around, the religious people, were very critical of Jesus because he was going to heal on the Sabbath day. And it says that Jesus was angry. He had this mental anger. But he said to the man with the withered hand, stand forth and stretch out your hand. And the man was healed. Jesus didn't allow the disgruntled behavior of the other people that were being critical of him to cause him to have an explosion of anger. He controlled his anger, and he did what he was supposed to do, which was to heal the man that was sick. Again, mental anger can be controlled, but must be controlled quickly or it's going to get out of control. Let me say control one more time. In Ephesians 4, in verse 31, let all bitterness and wrath, and that word wrath is thumos, is the outburst of anger, and anger, which is the other word, orge, and clamor and slander be put away from you, along with all malice. In other words, don't deal with the mental before it becomes an outburst. And when you study this subject in the scripture, it's pretty clear that the outburst of anger is always wrong. You can have a mental anger that isn't wrong and isn't sinful, but every outburst of anger is wrong. Unless it says that God, the wrath of God, but God is perfect and we're not. So we don't act out with anger. In Colossians 3:8 it says, but now you also put them all aside. What? Anger, wrath, malice, slander, and abusive speech from your mouth. These things should be put aside. We shouldn't live according to them. And then Psalm 37:8, which we looked at last night, it says, cease from anger and forsake wrath or rage. Do not fret, it leads only to evil doing. Interestingly enough, the New Testament is from the Greek, the Old Testament is from the Hebrew, and the literal word for anger here is nose. It's sticking out your nose or your nostrils, flaring your nostrils is what it's talking about. It's a whole different viewpoint. Your nostrils being flared out in anger. So cease from doing that. Put your nose back where it belongs. And forsake wrath, rage. Do not fret. It only leads to evil doing. Anger leads to evil doing. So it's something if we have it going on, we got to deal with it and deal with it quickly, or it's going to cause problems for us. It's going to cause evil doing. Now this phrase that we were looking at you can go back to Matthew, in Matthew 5 there with, verse 22, it talks about not calling someone, that's not 522, what is it? Yeah, 521, 522 is, whoever commits murder, but I say to you that everyone who is angry with his brother shall be guilty before the court, and whoever says to his brother, you good for nothing, shall be guilty before the Supreme Court. You good for nothing. In the King James Bible, it says raka, R-A-C-A, which is an Aramaic word which means empty-headed or empty or worthless. It's to demean someone. You good for nothing is kind of a weak translation. It's demeaning someone's character, someone's worth. It's really putting them down. We might say today, well, we would say most of these in a jestful manner, but bonehead, numbskull, nitwit, blockhead, and other. I have a few others that are not worth repeating. The word really has with it both a religious and moral overtones. It's really putting the person down. And if you do that, if you commit this, if you talk this way, you are guilty before the Supreme Court. You know what it says? Before the Supreme Court. And actually in the Greek, it's the word Sanhedrin. The Sanhedrin is the ruling body of Israel. That was the 70 rulers that ultimately decided to kill Christ. So, this is the ruling body. That's why the Supreme Court is a good thing. You're going through the highest court for saying you good for nothing. And then the last one was you fool. And if you say you fool, you're going to hell.
That sounds like the least thing.
Doesn't it? It's the reverse order, right? I mean, if you look at this chart that I put there, you have murder, anger, good for nothing, you fool. And then the consequence for murder is going to the court, and the same consequence for anger is going to court. Saying good for nothing, you go before the Sanhedrin, the Supreme Court. If you say fool, it's you're going to Gehenna, which is the hellfire, fire of hell. So obviously Jesus is using figurative language, and the point is getting across. If you will deal with the lesser, you'll never get to the greater. You'll never have an issue with murder if you deal with your mouth and calling somebody a fool or good for nothing or getting angry. If you deal with the lesser offense quickly and deal with it, then you'll never get to these horrific things that we might do. Again, Jesus had a unique way of teaching, and you have to really think about what he's saying. We obviously don't believe that you're going to go to hell for saying fool, because that means all of us are going to go to hell because you've called me a fool before, or somebody a fool. I mean, it's magnifying a point so that we get that you have to deal with your heart. You got to deal with the inside. Because you can't go to court and there's no court anywhere where you're going to be tried for inside anger, because nobody would know you have that inside anger. So it's not to be taken literal. It's to get this very powerful point together, is that to deal with the stuff that is on the inside before it comes out. Again, in your notes there, it says, angry thoughts and insulting words may never lead to the ultimate act of murder, yet tantamount to murder in God's sight. Yet they are tandem to murder in God's sight, because it says in 1 John 3:15, everyone who hates his brother is a murderer. Oh. And you know that no murderer has eternal life abiding in him. So God puts it, murder and hating, to be parallel. The two Greek words that are used to communicate the word hate, you see, is used in 1 John 3:15, everyone who hates. There's, again, like the word anger, there's two aspects of it. There's the inner disposition of the mind, and then there's the hate that is active ill will towards others. And again, what we're talking about here is the active ill will towards others. But either way, hate is not something that we want to have in our lives. Sin is not only in act. So what Jesus is getting across to us, sin is not only in actions, but it's also in thoughts and words. Jesus elevates the standard from mere outward actions to issues of the heart. Anger and hate are serious issues that can lead to destructive outcomes. If we control the lesser, then the greater will never happen. Jesus commands a deeper and more demanding than just what was written in the Sixth Commandment. The Sixth Commandment is, thou shalt not murder. Well, Jesus takes it to a whole greater level, really demanding so much more from us. Obviously, we're not supposed to murder, but we're not supposed to call people fool or good for nothing, and we're not supposed to get angry with people. We're supposed to live according to the Beatitudes as someone who has a pure heart, someone that has a merciful attitude, someone that is a peacemaker, and not someone who is antagonistic and fighting and going through all these other things. Then in the next verse in Matthew 5 is verse 23. Therefore, Matthew 5, verse 23. Therefore, if you are presenting your offering at the altar, and there remember that your brother has something against you, leave your offering there before the altar and go first reconcile to your brother, and then come and present your offering. Well, this is, in their time, at the time of the writing of this, the temple was central, and this is something that they would relate to. If it was written today, the way it would be said, or the essence of what is how we interpret it, is that don't go to church and worshiping God and praising God and doing all the things of God and think it's okay with God when you have an offense that you haven't reconciled with your brother. Go deal with that offense that you have with your brother, then come back and worship God. Because you can't treat your brother bad and hate your brother and think you're good with God. It doesn't work that way. God says, if you love me, you love your brother also. Then the next part of this verse says, make friends quickly with your opponent at law while you are with him on the way, so that your opponent may not hand you over to the judge, and the judge to the officer, and you be thrown into prison. Truly I say to you, you will not come out of there until you have paid up the least cent. Again, in studying the teachings of Jesus, it's imperative that we get his point and don't get lost in the examples that he's giving. What is the point that he's getting across here? Well, he's using two different things, two different illustrations. One is with the church, and the other was with the law court. One is with a brother, and one is with an enemy. The point is immediacy of action. Immediately, as soon as you are conscious of the broken fellowship that you would have with your brother, go resolve it. Or on your way to court, deal with it. Deal with the guy that you have the problem with, or the gal that you have the problem with. Resolve it before you get to the court. Because once you get to court, and you get in the legal system, now things are going to get complicated. And the next thing you know, you get convicted. And if you get convicted, they hand you over to the jailer. And if they hand you over to the jailer, you get put in jail. And you're not getting out of jail until you can resolve the issue. And you can't resolve the issue because you're in jail. So the point is, deal with something when it comes up before it gets out of control and you can't deal with it effectively. And that's, obviously that's really good advice in human relationships with our brothers and sisters in Christ, or with your boss, or, people in the world. You got issues, get it resolved. Don't let it linger. And then, same thing with legal issues or any of these things, You don't pay your taxes, and the next thing you know, you're being charged interest, and it just, the interest keeps on multiplying. Same thing with credit cards. You don't pay your credit card off, and then the interest that comes on, it just gets worse, and it gets worse. And then you can never pay it off. You just keep on paying on the interest rather than on the principal. Deal with things immediately before they get out of control. The context of this, what we just got done reading, is about murder, about anger, about calling people good for nothing and fool. Deal with issues so you don't get into doing that kind of thing if you deal with issues immediately. It's pretty easy to say bad things about other people, but we want to avoid that. We're different. We're not like everybody else. Jesus' teachings are indeed very, very radical, but they also are all very, very godly, and they're the right way to live. Now, the next subject is adultery. You have heard, in Matthew 5, verse 27, you have heard that it was said, you shall not commit adultery. And adultery is dealing with the 7th commandment of the 10 commandments and the 10th commandment. Well, the 7th commandment says, do not commit adultery. The 10th commandment says, do not covet your neighbor's wife. If you covet your neighbor's wife, that would be committing adultery in your mind. So, you shall not commit adultery. But I say to you that everyone who looks at a woman with lust for her has already committed adultery with her in his heart. And then the latter part of that we'll get to in a minute. The prohibition of murder included anger and insulting words. Adultery includes the lustful look and imagination. We can commit murder with our words, and we can commit adultery with our hearts and our minds. He is not forbidding looking at women, but he's forbidding looking lustfully at women. You know the difference between looking and lusting. If you don't, you should. This is not something, in reading through this, I don't think that we should just think this is referring to married men and adultery, but it also includes women, because women can do the same thing. And I also don't think it's just talking about married people. I think single people can do the same thing. Single people can look at others, whether it's a man or a woman, can look at someone from the opposite sex, or the way it is today, even in the same sex, and have lust. And he's saying that lust that's in your heart needs to be dealt with. And he says he's considering looking at a woman to lust after her is the same as it's adultery. It's the same as if you had sex with her. So again, you get my point. I don't think we should just understand this in the parameter of marriage and adultery, but in any sexual act where we have to control our thoughts and not let it be done in our minds and our hearts. And I tell you, men are stimulated with sight, by sight. A man looks at a woman, or he looks at pornography, he looks at that, and he's stimulated by sight. Women are not as much so. They're stimulated by relationships and other things. So, it is wise for a Christian woman to understand that, and for a Christian woman to dress and to present herself in a fashion that isn't tempting men to lust after her. There's a big difference. There's not the scriptures specifically. It talks about it in Timothy. It talks about women. There's nothing wrong with women wanting to be attractive. I mean, that's a good thing. But there's a big difference between being attractive and being seductive. Being, what is that word? Seductive, yeah. So, I go to the gym frequently, and I marvel at the outfit some of these young girls come in with. It leaves no imagination at all. I mean, their boobs are hanging out, and the outline of their private parts is, it's just absurd. And what I do, as I say, God, please bless this woman or this girl and help her to know you someday. And I look away, because I don't, that's what we're talking about here. Because lust can be an issue of the heart. Lust is always an issue of the heart. And then it manifests itself out sometimes, other times not. Even if it doesn't manifest itself out, even if the person doesn't have sex when he or she is not supposed to, if they've got it going on in their heart, it's equal in God's eyes to that sin, the sin of acting it out. Just like we've seen with anger and what we've seen with hate, You got inside, and then you got the acting. And if you deal with the inside, then the acting part will not be an issue. That makes sense, right? Job understood all of this. Look at these verses in Job. I think I have it on the screen. Job 31. I have made a covenant with my eyes. How then could I gaze at a virgin? In my step, say what? If my step was turned from the way, or my heart followed my eyes, or if any spot has stuck to my hands. In other words, he's reiterating what we're saying here, that, he's controlling his eyes so that his heart doesn't get messed up. If my heart has been enticed by a woman, or I have lurked at my neighbor's doorway, or my neighbor's wife, he understood that looking at these things and producing these things in his mind would bring it into manifestation in his life. The latter part of that, Matthew 5:27, where right after it talks about this adultery in the heart, well, I'll read the whole thing. Matthew 5:27 through 30 says, you have heard that it was said, you shall not commit adultery. But I say to you that everyone who looks at a woman with lust for her has already committed adultery with her in his heart. If your right hand makes you stumble, tear it out and throw it from you. For it is better for you to lose one of the parts of your body than your whole body to be thrown into hell. If your right hand makes you stumble, cut it off and throw it from you. For it is better for you to lose one of the parts of your body than your whole body to go into hell. Look at Matthew chapter 18. Matthew chapter 18. So, let's look at this verse. Read it. 18:8. If your hand or your foot causes you to stumble, cut it off and throw it from you. It is better for you to enter life crippled or lame than to have 2 hands and 2 feet and cast into eternal fire. If your eyes cause you to stumble, pluck it out and throw it from you. It is better for you to enter life with 1 eye than to have 2 eyes and to be cast into fiery hell. See then that you do not, then it goes on. So in Matthew 18 added your foot. So if you see someone who's missing an eye and both his hands and his feet, you can be well assured that he's going into the kingdom. No, right? I mean, obviously this cannot be taken literally. What is it saying? What it's saying is whatever it is that you're looking at that's causing you to sin, stop looking at it. Look away. And, this is following what we just talked about with adultery. That you can lust in your heart. Well, if you're staring, if at the gym I'm looking at these girls that are dressed in such a manner and I'm allowing my mind to think of sexual activity with them, then, it would have been so much easier just to look away and then not be tempted with this. When I was growing, I was a young boy. I was born in 1950, which was 5 years or so after World War II. And there were during the 50s, there were lots of war movies. That's when From Here to Eternity and the Audie Murphy. And I used to watch all these war movies until I was 16 or 17 when my brother, I mentioned this earlier in the class, that my brother was killed in Vietnam. And from that time on, if I watched a war movie, it really triggered something inside of me. It caused me to have anger and bitterness, and it would only be a short time and I would get in a fist fight with somebody. Of course, I had a few drinks before that, but it got me, so I stopped watching. I haven't watched those war movies about Vietnam. I've never watched any of them because it triggers something. And don't look at things that are going to cause you to sin. whatever it may be. There's some people that, they can look at violent movies and all the rest, and it doesn't bother them at all. And others of us have limitations. My wife is, she's got a high tolerance for Hallmark movies, and that's about it. If there was a little bit less of a predictable ending, I perhaps could get into it myself, but So, whatever you're looking at that's causing you to stumble, just stop looking at it. Whatever you're doing with your hands, whatever you're doing in life that would cause you to stumble, stop doing it. There's some people that go to work every day, and as they go to work, it makes them miserable and bitter and resentful. They just hate their job. Well, I don't know, here's an idea. You might think about getting a different job. Or change your mind and your attitude. Ask God to change your mind and attitude about the job. Or there's some people that, they go to school and they just hate it. It brings out all these change. You have to either stop going to that school, or maybe you can't do that, but you can get help in changing your mind. Whatever you're doing that's causing you to stumble, stop doing it. If you have an issue with obesity, you have a trouble with that, then don't work at a donut shop. Or don't bring in the food into your house that's going to tempt you when you look at it to eat it. It's just common sense. And don't go to places, don't go to places that are going to tempt you to sin. I always think of this fella, and I've talked about it before. Many years ago, this young man who had been a homosexual, and when he accepted Christ into his life, he had changed from that lifestyle, and he didn't want to live that way anymore. And when I met him, he was in an ambassador program, a witnessing program, missionary program, and he was telling me that he was going to homosexual bars to witness because he could relate to these people. I said, I don't think that's a real good idea for you to do that. Why are you putting yourself in a situation to be constantly tempted with that which was a real stumbling block for you? Sure enough, a year or two later, he came down with AIDS, and he died very quickly thereafter. You can't, if you're a guy who has problems with alcohol, I don't know if you want to be a bartender. You know what I mean? And whatever it may be, what you look at, what you do, where you go, can influence what comes into your heart, and what's in your heart is what's in your life. And, we want to have the godly things in our heart and our life. So that's just a tremendous wisdom of Jesus, putting this before us. How do you deal with these, anger issues? Well, and all the rest. You get the point. Isn't that tremendous? I think I probably put in your notes, pornography is a major problem today, that so many men are caught up into this, and it is so unhealthy for them. It's degrading to women, and it puts in their minds and their hearts things that are not real. That these people are stimulated by drugs or demons, and it's all bad. And then I kind of end on this before we move on to this next subject, and that is that it's my business is to mind my business. I have to decide what I can look at and what I can do and where I can go. And I understand that your limitations may not be the same as mine. There's that chapter in Romans, and there's also in Corinthians, where it talks about, some of us can't. Some of us are not mature enough to think that we can eat all meats. Others of us are less mature. And it's not my business to judge you for what you decide you can't do, or to judge the other person for what they decided they can do. Maybe you can watch war movies, maybe I can't. That doesn't make me better than you. It just makes me responsible for myself. So stop judging other people and mind your own business. That's what I'm trying to say there. In Matthew chapter 5. Verse 31. Matthew 5:31 says what, Vince? I don't know. Well, let's take a look. Matthew 5:31. It was said, whoever sends his wife away, let him give her a certificate of divorce. But I say to you, that everyone who divorces his wife except for the reason of unchastity makes her commit adultery, and whoever marries a divorced woman commits adultery. So this is now he goes back and elaborates more on the subject matter of adultery and divorce and this whole matter here. And this is a very difficult topic to address and to understand, especially these days in our culture. However, it's important to see what Jesus teaches on the subject. In Matthew 19, he gives a somewhat more detailed explanation of this subject. In Matthew 19, if you would turn to it in verse 3, some Pharisees came to Jesus testing him and asking, "Is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife for any reason at all?" You would think the Pharisees would have gotten the point that it wasn't wise to try to test Jesus. I mean, but they kept on trying to do it. And their question was, is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife for any reason at all? And verse 4 says, "And he answered and said, have you not read that he whom created them from the beginning made them male and female, and said, for this reason a man shall leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. So they are no longer two, but one flesh. Whatever therefore God has joined together, let no man separate." Now there's some depth to this understanding that we need to look at and to understand, but we're going to take a break before we do that.